Welcome everyone to our next edition of our Quilts equals Art equals Quilts Artist Talks. I'm joined today by Victoria Findlay Wolfe. Victoria has taught with us before at QBL, and she also had a solo exhibition with us years ago at the Schweinfurth, so we really love her work and we're excited for her to join us today. Hello, Victoria.
Hey, Davana, how are you?
Doing okay, welcome. I wanted to ask you, you were in the gallery a couple weeks ago and we talked to you a little bit about your two quilts in the show, and I had some follow-up questions.
Sure.
And I know that you have a fine arts background and that, you know, your quilts were sort of frowned on in that world. In these two pieces that we have on view, you've incorporated some photography into those and also using the traditional patterning, traditional techniques.
Right.
But in both pieces, it's you, right? It's your hands and your face. And
in those two particular pieces, yes.
Yeah. So I was wondering, why did you choose yourself to be in those pieces?
All of my work sort of revolves around my grandmother, Elda Wolfe, who was a quilter, and the Double Wedding Ring series that I started was based on happy memories of my childhood. So a lot of these works are either about me or about people that incorporate a memory from my family. So that particular case was sort of diving in a little bit closer on not so much my other family members or happy memories, but other things that bring me joy, like the process of creating. So the double wedding ring with the space between heartbeats is about the process, right? So it's a tactile thing. I needed my hands in there. It's how I create my quilts. I design everything on the wall. I don't design on paper. So I'm cutting fabrics and I'm sticking things up on the wall and I'm moving them around until I get the effect that I wanted. The other piece that's hanging there, the Year of Moments. Yes. At the time, it was a call for entry, and that was sort of the theme about moments. And for me, it was at a time when my daughter was graduating. So even though it's a picture of me, it's actually about my wrinkles and how I've changed and physically. So that's why it's an image of myself. It's also about the travels and everything that we've done in 18 years of raising our daughter. When I did the interview with you guys, I talked about how one of the first classes challenges that I had given to my players on 15 Minutes of Play website quite a while ago when blogs were popular. It was about looking at pictures of yourself, and I found that people were really, really uncomfortable with that. So about every 10 years or so, I take a moment. This year was another big moment because I turned 50 this year, to look again at how have I changed in 10 years? What do I see now? You know, my eyes have changed. My physical features have changed, that my process has changed, the way that I look at creative things has changed. And, you know, I wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit and incorporate all of that. A little bit of process, a little bit about how I got there, you know, physicalities of what I'm looking like, but still always coming back around and incorporating traditional aspects in my quilts and trying to keep working forward so that I'm constantly doing something different.
When you say that the way you look at your creative process changed, what would you say is the biggest change from these 10 years in how you create?
I think the process changes every day. Things that I was good at then seem very, not trivial, but maybe not as complicated. You know, my skills have gotten better. The way that I piece has gotten better. The way that I think deeper about a subject has gotten better. You know, I can't say that always my colors have gotten better because my eyes are getting worse. So depending on the time of day, I can't tell the difference between a couple colors.
They get brighter and brighter and brighter.
There are just things that change. So, you know, one thing I want to keep doing is to keep thinking about my process and looking at how it's changing or evolving, finding things that I still haven't done, or going back and revisiting something that I thought I did pretty good at, but seeing if I can do it even better or do something different to it or incorporate another thing. So, you know, for me, the series of quilts that I'm working on now, like like we'd mentioned about adding photography, it's a combination of the things that I was doing in college. I was a fine art degree and I did a lot of photography, but that was where my quilt making sort of stalled for a bit. I've been sewing and quilting for 35 years. So I took a break at that time. I was making a lot of my clothes. So sort of revisiting that, like, where would it have gone if I would have stayed in quilting and textiles? Where would that have gone? If we had textile design at the time, where would I have gone? So just sort of using that as a platform to investigate other options of things that maybe weren't complete thoughts then try to make them more a complete thought now.
Yeah, I find that in the artist practice, everyone wants to think of your trajectory as this like straight line that goes from here to here, but it really is like a spiral. Yeah. You just sort of come back to the same thing again and again and again and again in a different way.
But there's a million different paths to take from that point. Mm-hmm. So, and I find that often when I'm teaching and stuff, it's I can teach people the techniques and everything, but what I'm really spending a lot of time doing is teaching people, how do you see that? How do you look for those things? So a lot of the time that's what I'm focused on. And that's what I try to push my students to do, is just to look a little bit deeper. Maybe their first idea might be the best one, but maybe there's something a little bit deeper, a little bit different that you could do, a different path that you can take. And not always having to know exactly what the outcome is going to be when you sit down to make something. I lose interest if you said, here's a picture of what you need to make now. I'm like, I can't do it. I can't make it. I need to be able to cut the fabrics. I need to throw them on the wall. I need to push them around. I need to try different values, different colors, see how they interact with each other. Because I find people just spend way too much time up here going, I know what it's going to look like. Well, it's not about what you know, it's what do you see? Try to get back to your eyes. That's why when people take pictures on their phones and then they look at it, they're like, it looks so different. It's because then, your mind is not telling you what you're seeing. You're taking a minute to see it in a different light. So it's always a good exercise to look at something in a different way, to make sure that you're actually looking at it and not just filling it in with the information you already have in your brain.
On a quick glance at your work, a person might assume that it's sort of traditional. There is some traditional patterning, but there's something that you do very differently than other traditional quilters. There's some concept going on, and you talk about each quilt has a memory and some of this backstory. And one thing with your double wedding ring quilts, and even in the quilt that's in the show to a degree, there's a certain amount of dissolving of the composition. Can you talk a little bit about, like, there is some deeper meaning, and do you mind that not everyone can feel it, or
not at all. I love hearing good and bad comments, because everybody can have their own perspective, but I don't make quilts to get the perspective of other people. I make the quilts because I have to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm putting out there whatever it is I need to do, but I don't think my intention, is as important to the viewer who's looking at it. Mm-hmm. I play with a lot of different levels. I'm trying to do layering within a traditional aspect. So part of that plays into it. You also have the sort of modern aspect and the art aspect and the traditional aspect kind of blended together. So the modern aspect of using negative space. How do you get foreground and background when you're only using basically a two-dimensional surface? I'm trying to pull things apart, and I'm also trying to tell the viewer where I want them to look within my work. So the amount of color that lands in one space or an odd color that lands in another, so that when someone is walking up to it, they might not know the story behind what the quilt is about, but the way I'm directing you where I want you to look in the quilt. That's generally, I try to have that as an aspect in my work.
Another thing that's difficult for our regular viewers to discern if they're just looking at photographs of your work, and is why you should, if you feel safe, come by the Art Center before January 10th and see her quilts in person, is the quilting. The quilting on your quilts is particularly lovely, and an aspect of all of the quilts in the show that's just impossible to photograph always. Can you talk a little bit about that part of the process?
Yeah, so on my larger pieces, my best friend Shelly her and I do collaborative work together.
Mm-hmm.
I used to have 2 long arm machines. I recently got rid of both of them. They're just giant quilt racks for me. I don't enjoy that part as much, although I've quilted plenty of my own quilts. Smaller works, I tend to quilt them myself. So the Year of Moments, I quilted, and the Space Between a Heartbeat, Shelly did. And we have a lot of conversations about, I'm telling her what the story is behind the quilt. I'm telling her ideas and details or shapes and things that I want to stand out within the work. And then I'm asking her for her input for what she sees from her end when she's looking at it. So that is a constant conversation that we're having. Every piece is different. Sometimes we'll talk about something for weeks. Sometimes I'll be like, this is all I got. What can you do with that? Sometimes a very limited amount of information. And that's also something that I really enjoy. I love adding the second person's part of the story. And oftentimes if I haven't quilted it, or if Shelly hasn't quilted, if I've had another quilter quilt on it, I'm giving it to them for a particular reason that I want them to be able to add their story to the quilt as well. So that again just adds another layer to the design of what's happening in the overall story in my head and their head.
Yeah. It creates a depth. There is this extra layer on it. The design of the piecing and the colors can be really striking, but when you approach it and see that extra texture, the places that pop out are actually popped out, and the places that recede receding. It's wonderful, and it's definitely I've talked to a lot of quilters about their relationship with the person who quilts. Sometimes not all quilters quilt their own stuff, and it's never just the people who are really thinking of these as artworks. It's never just handed off. It's always these long conversations that produce.
One of the things I do is I make a lot of big quilts. I like big, I like impact, I like having a larger space to be able to tell a story. But I do enjoy when I have something smaller that I'm making, because then I'll hand quilt it, because I prefer the look that I can do myself, because I think of the like a big stitch in hand quilting more like just as a line, as if I'm drawing or painting. So I like to be able to do that, and I find I have more control over that than when I'm free motion quilting myself. So I enjoy on my smaller projects, I'll pretty much always hand quilt them. I find that a little bit of a luxury to be able to sit there and do that, because I can't do that on all of my work, because I just don't have enough hours in the day. I got to get other stuff done. I got to have more ideas. I got more quilts I want to get made in my lifetime. So I have to be picky and choosy about what I spend time with and hand quilt.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you about is specific quilt patterns. You always reference or touch upon or have some historical or your own created pattern, but they have these historical feel, like you're kind of known for the double wedding rings and certain patterns. Do those have like specific meanings to you when you incorporate these? Like, it's almost like using a well-known like color in a painting, right? Like if you like cadmium has its kind of language, right? Do you feel that?
I'll tell you about the double wedding ring. That was totally sort of by accident. I made my first one when I was wanting to start a new quilt. I was looking for something I hadn't done before, and I hadn't made a double wedding ring. And I thought, well, let's try that, right? So once I made the first double wedding ring, I was having all of these little explosions of ideas of things that I thought, oh, well, that cut up really interesting, or that line worked really well, or I can overlap color in an interesting way. Because if you think about, like, if I have a 12.5-inch block quilt, right? I got all my blocks sewn, and I'm going to end up with my seams with all the horizontal and vertical seams visible. But when you're playing with a double wedding ring and you have all these curves and they're all intersecting and coming together, I can dissolve the way that it was pieced. Even though you see it as a double wedding ring, I can dissolve the piecing structure without being stuck to that horizontal grid that you're constantly seeing by the invisible seams, right? So I love how I can just sort of manipulate what's happening easier and not be left with that grid that happens in a traditional block quilt.
Yeah.
So it's purely for structural and for being able to push the color around, just like if I was on a canvas, right? Mm-hmm. Just pushing the stuff around. I can do it easier within that pattern, and that's the part that's been the most intriguing to me within the double wedding ring. So sometimes I'm looking for other traditional blocks that I can do that with, or to get some other interesting effect. But there'll probably be more double wedding rings in my future.
Yeah.
It works. It's fun. It's interesting to me.
So speaking of, in the future, behind you is a particularly interesting composition you've got on the wall. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now?
So I've done several quilts. One of the first quilts in this digital series I did was on my grandmother. Mm-hmm. And it was made out of double knit polyester, and it was done in a way that was very similar to the quilts that she made. So I've done a lot sort of around my grandmother and her quilts. And so I wanted to do something on my grandfather. His name was Leo. And some interesting things happened. So if I scooch out of the way, you can see it's my grandfather holding his dog Herman. It was his birthday. And, I was flipping through my family photos, and I found this photo because I was trying to find a really good picture of my grandfather. He passed away when I was quite young. I was the only granddaughter out of a bunch of boys. So I was a bit of an apple of his eye, and I was very, very fond of him. And we look very similar. We take after each other. But when I found this photo, I was looking and I was trying to remember in my grandparents' kitchen. And I remember their floor was always this, they had a floor in their house that was like one of those old orange brick linoleum. Like everybody had this in their house in the 50s and the 60s. And then they had this orange linoleum stuff on the walls. And when I pulled that out and I realized my kitchen is the same color. So I start to make connections to why I like particular colors and colors that I use regularly. So that there's sort of an unconscious thing about the way that I'm using color. So I'm really playing with those weird golds and weird browns in this picture and trying to do something that really feels like my grandfather. And it's not so much that it's an important piece or in depth, but I'm going to be playing again with layers. You see some weird colors coming in on the top up here. You can see that the cake pan is sort of jutting out of the picture. I'm kind of playing with how it sits within the traditional piecing that I'm putting in the background. Not my usual color palette. So sometimes using the colors that are already in the photo to sort of direct where the story's going and how to make it pleasing or interesting. So that's just something that's been hanging there, and this has been up and down off my wall for probably the last 5 months or so. And now I think it'll probably be done this week because I feel like I leave it hang there long enough and looking at it long enough, then a lot of the answers just sort of happen.
That's fascinating because I don't work that way. I work just slow and steady along that just takes forever. So it's interesting to hear that it percolates for you and then just
percolate. All of my stuff does. I've got piles. I just merged my New York City studio with my studio here at Long Island, and this is a very small room. So I've got boxes and boxes of projects that sit, and some are 10 years old, some I started last year. I don't get hung up on whether or not I finish something immediately. If it needs to come down, it comes down. It'll go back up eventually. And again, I'll have new eyes. I'll have new ideas. I'll do new things. Might take something in a completely different direction. I love that. I love it that it just becomes whatever it needs to, whenever it needs to.
Yeah. So I know you did just sort of get into this new space. If you want to show us around your new space, if you feel like, not want to, that's fine too.
It's not as horrible as it was. I did recently show on Instagram when I was rearranging and it looked like a complete bomb went off. Yeah. This room is like probably 9 by 11, so it's not very big, and I am really packed in here. So my studio that I had in New York City was about 4 times this space. So when I moved all that stuff out here, yeah, it looked like a complete disaster area until I had some time to pull everything out and pull a few things back in. So I line all my walls with Quilter's Dream cotton. That's always a question I get. You can see the drape of my batting hanging on the wall there, but I just completely cover any flat walls that I have in here with batting because they'll hold the shapes easily. I don't have to pin anything. It'll hold a completed quilt that's king size without a pin on it, so it just sticks. It's great. I have lovely sliding glass doors right outside, so I get a lot of natural light in here. I have random extra boards that I've covered with batting. This was my old refrigerator door. I don't throw anything out, so I can move that around wherever I need it to because, again, I'm limited to the amount of pieces. I used to be able to work on 12 to 15 pieces at a time in my old studio. I currently have 5 up, and I only have 2 walls, really, in this space. So I'm going to unhook myself here a second. My dogs, of course, have to have their spot on top of the dogs, on top of the dog bed. I have got lots of shelving since I'm a fabric designer as well, so I have all of my own fabrics here. I have this one long wall over here, so I've got more of my solid fabrics. I have my cutting table. I have a couple shelves. That's pretty much all of my stash. People say that's a lot of fabric. It's really not. This is, again, it's a very tiny room. And then I have more of my fabrics on bolts, things that are from my own collection. So I have to have that stuff handy. I have my ironing table off to the side over there. I have 2 desks put together that have my cutting tables on surfaces as well, along with my sewing machine. And I have one small design wall behind me. And this poor quilt, again, I flip-flop between very traditional works, scrappy quilts, modern quilts, art quilts. I do whatever floats my boat on any given day. So this poor thing has been up there for months. Some fine year that will get finished. I don't know when, sadly not fast enough. And I just keep a few little inspiration pieces. I could probably put more batting up, but I just have to have a few happy little pieces around me, things that I have. And these are just, again, a traditional piece that I'm working on and something that I just finished. And I'm reminding myself that I need to sew sleeves on because I love to leave those to the very last minute. Because it's the most boring part of the process is to sew sleeves on. So it's a very small room. And that's been an adjustment because I've got probably 15 more bins of projects and things that I've been working on and things that I'd like to pull out and go back and forth with.
So you've mentioned a little bit about your fabric design. So for those of you who don't know about Victoria, she designs fabric. She has a shop. She authors books. You do pattern design,
pattern templates,
quilt making, quilting, modern quilting, art quilting. I'm not going to ask you how you juggle it because that's just because we all just managed to do it. But
pre-COVID, I had a store in New York City, but since COVID, I've closed the store because we've moved out to our house on Long Island. I had to leave some of my staff go, so it's just me and my assistant now. So, I'm not getting as much done as I had been getting done, but, it's as everybody else, we're making changes and we're rolling with the changes and we sell online. I've been selling online for years, so hasn't been a hard transition. It's just the amount of time in the day and not having enough hands to do everything.
How does the combination of all of that bleed into one another? What about owning the shop affects the studio, and what about being the practicing quilt maker artist affects the fabric? How does it all begin to bleed together, and does it better each action better the other?
Sometimes I'm working on something and I'll be like, oh, this has to be a pattern, or this needs to be a template because this will be really fun for everybody else, or it's something that I can teach from, right? Sometimes I'm working on something that just needs to be an art piece. Some things are patternable, some things are not. I do a lot of work on my phone. I've done several fabric lines on my phone. So if I'm not in my studio, if that photography half of me kicks in, and I'm very adept at playing and changing and turning things into other things. And it's yet another tool for me to create with. And I kind of enjoy all aspects of it. So sometimes I think, well, maybe I should stop doing something else or focus on this or whatnot. I had actually planned 2 years ago, because as a traveling quilt teacher, you plan your year out or two out, for where you're going to be teaching. And 2 years ago, I made the decision that I was going to need a break starting fall 2020 and taking 2021 off of teaching. And then you laugh, because clearly Mother Nature decided that was a good idea, because I've been home. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I wanted to have more time to work on art pieces and to really just take a break from teaching and lecturing. And I did start over a year ago, before COVID, teaching online and teaching online in person. So I find it very interesting that now everybody's doing that, because nobody was doing it a year ago when travel was restricting me from getting to a teaching gig. And so I was teaching via FaceTime, and that's been really interesting. But now that everybody's doing it, I'm not teaching right now, or not, just taking a break and trying to focus on some of the things that I just have not had time to do. So that balance of how does it work?
It's somehow
COVID happens. It's just that the story changes in the direction and the focus of what I get to do at that particular time. So a lot of these pieces have been put on hold and have been in my brain for years, and just did not have the time to do it when I was running the store and the studio in the city and everything else that was going on there. And now I'm getting some time to be able to get back and make some of the pieces that I really want to spend some time with. So that's been a bit of a luxury to have that.
And another question I had for you was, I've heard you have a nice little collection of polyester quilts.
Because of my grandmother's quilts, I've been collecting polyester quilts for a very long time, and I'm just kind of fascinated. And that's something I really enjoy doing, is playing with other kind of fibers and stuff, because it forces me to manipulate it in a different way. With a double knit polyester, it doesn't fray. I don't have to sew the edges in. I can leave them on top. I can stitch over it. I can just, manipulate it in different ways than I can with cotton.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us into your studio today, Victoria. If you guys want to learn more about Victoria and all that she does, you can visit her website, check out her store. And thanks for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was really nice. And thank you so much. I'm so tickled to be included in the Quilts Equal Art Equals Quilts, because quilts are art. Thank you.